The morning sun cast long shadows across the Naval Special Warfare Command training facility in Coronado, California. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez adjusted her Kevlar vest one final time before stepping through the chain-link gates that separated the public parking area from the restricted training grounds. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her compact frame moving with the deliberate precision of someone who had spent years perfecting every motion. At 28, Maria had already served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a Marine Corps sniper. Her record spoke for itself. 43 confirmed kills, including a shot that took down an insurgent leader from over 800 meters during the Battle of Marja. But today, she wasn't wearing her Marine dress blues or carrying her military credentials. Today, she was just another civilian contractor hired to consult on long-range precision training protocols. The assignment had come through unusual channels. Admiral James Hutchinson, commanding officer of the West Coast SEAL teams, had personally requested her expertise after reviewing classified after-action reports from recent Middle Eastern operations. Several SEAL units had struggled with extreme long-range engagements, missing critical shots that could have prevented casualties. The Admiral wanted fresh perspective on training methods, and Maria's reputation for unorthodox but effective techniques had reached his attention. She approached the main administrative building where Chief Petty Officer Derek Morrison waited with barely concealed irritation. Morrison was a 20-year veteran who had earned his reputation leading SEAL Team 6 through some of the most dangerous operations in recent memory. His weathered face and steel-gray eyes reflected the skepticism that had been brewing since he first heard about this consultation. "You must be Rodriguez," Morrison said, his tone flat and professional but lacking warmth. "I'm Chief Morrison. I'll be your liaison during this evaluation." Maria extended her hand, which Morrison shook briefly. She noticed how his grip tested her strength, a subtle challenge that she met with steady pressure of her own. "Thank you, Chief. I understand there are some concerns about long-range accuracy in recent operations." Morrison's jaw tightened slightly. "Look, Rodriguez, I don't know what strings you pulled to get this assignment, but let me be clear about something. My men are the best trained shooters in the world. We don't need some Marine playing dress-up to tell us how to do our jobs." The comment hung in the air like smoke from a muzzle flash. Maria had encountered this attitude before, the assumption that her small stature and gender somehow diminished her capabilities. She had learned long ago that the best response wasn't anger or defensiveness, but simply letting her work speak for itself. "I appreciate your directness, Chief," she replied calmly. "I'm not here to change anything that's working. I'm here to observe your current training protocols and offer suggestions based on what I've learned in the field." Morrison led her through the facility, pointing out various training areas with professional detachment. The complex was impressive. Multiple shooting ranges designed for different scenarios, from close-quarters combat to extreme long-range precision. They passed groups of SEAL trainees running through exercises, their movements fluid and coordinated despite the intense physical demands. "Range 7 is where we conduct our precision training," Morrison explained as they approached a long, narrow building. "We've got targets out to 1,200 meters, computer-controlled wind simulation, and the most advanced ballistic monitoring systems in the military." Through the observation windows, Maria could see several SEALs working with Barrett M82 rifles, their massive .50 caliber rounds designed for extreme range work. The shooters were clearly skilled, their positions textbook perfect, breathing controlled and deliberate. But as she watched their shot patterns on the electronic displays, she began to notice subtle inconsistencies. "What's your current qualification standard for the 1,000-meter targets?" she asked, making mental notes. 80% hit probability in ideal conditions, 70% with environmental factors, Morrison answered with evident pride. "That's well above standard military requirements." Maria nodded thoughtfully. The numbers were indeed impressive by conventional standards, but she had seen what was possible with different training approaches. During her second deployment, she had worked with British SAS snipers whose techniques produced 95% accuracy at similar ranges. The difference wasn't in equipment or natural talent. It was in methodology. They entered the range control room, where Petty Officer First Class Mike Thompson was monitoring the current training session. Thompson was younger than Morrison, perhaps 35, with the lean build of a distance runner and the focused intensity of someone who took his responsibility seriously. He glanced up as they entered, his expression shifting to curiosity when he saw Maria. "Thompson, this is Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Morrison said. "She's here to observe our precision training protocols." Thompson stood and offered a more genuinely welcoming handshake than Morrison had provided. "Mom, good to have you here. We're always looking for ways to improve our accuracy rates." "What Thompson isn't telling you," Morrison interjected, "is that he holds the current base record for long-range precision. 11 confirmed hits out of 12 attempts at the 1,000-meter line. That's using our standard M24 system, not the heavy .50 cal gear." Maria was genuinely impressed. The M24 was a precision instrument, but achieving that level of accuracy at extreme range required exceptional skill. "That's outstanding, Petty Officer. What was the environmental condition during that qualification?" "Light crosswind, maybe 8 knots from the southeast," Thompson replied. "Humidity was about 60%, temperature around 75 degrees. Pretty much ideal conditions, honestly." As they spoke, Maria continued watching the current training session through the observation window. She noticed that while the SEALs were highly skilled, their approach followed very traditional methodology. They relied heavily on ballistic computers and wind measurement devices, which was entirely appropriate for most situations. But she had learned techniques that could maintain accuracy even when technology failed or wasn't available. "Chief Morrison," she said carefully, "would it be possible for me to observe some training under more challenging conditions? Perhaps with equipment limitations or simulated combat stress?" Morrison's expression hardened. "Rodriguez, these men train under conditions you can't imagine. They perform precision shots while under enemy fire, with buildings collapsing around them, with wounded teammates depending on their accuracy. I don't think you understand the level of stress they operate under." The dismissive tone was clear, but Maria maintained her professional composure. She understood Morrison's protective instinct toward his men, and she knew that earning their respect would take more than credentials or recommendations from admirals. "I don't doubt their courage or skill under pressure, Chief. I've read the after-action reports. I'm more interested in the technical aspects of their training, breath control, trigger mechanics, environmental adaptation. Sometimes small adjustments to technique can produce significant improvements in accuracy." Thompson looked intrigued by the conversation, but Morrison remained skeptical. "Look, Rodriguez, we appreciate the Admiral sending you here, but our training protocols have been developed over decades of real-world experience. We've had the best military marksmen in the world contributing to these methods. I'm not sure what a Marine sniper thinks she can add to that." The challenge was implicit but clear. Maria recognized the test for what it was. Morrison wanted to see if she would back down or prove herself. She had faced similar situations throughout her military career, and she had learned that the only way to gain respect was through demonstration, not argument. "Chief, would it be possible for me to participate in tomorrow's precision training session? I'd like to experience your protocols firsthand before making any observations or suggestions." Morrison's eyes narrowed slightly, and she could see him calculating the political implications of her request. Allowing a civilian contractor to participate in live-fire exercises would require additional paperwork and approval, but refusing might appear unprofessional given her official assignment. "That would be unusual," he said slowly. "Our insurance protocols for civilian contractors are pretty restrictive for live-fire exercises. I maintain current military contractor certifications for exactly this type of situation," Maria replied smoothly. "All my paperwork should be in order through Admiral Hutchinson's office." Thompson glanced between them, clearly sensing the undercurrent of tension. "Chief, if the Admiral approved her participation, we could set up a standard qualification course. Might be interesting to get an outside perspective on our procedures." Morrison was quiet for several seconds, weighing his options. Maria could see the conflict in his expression, his instinctive resistance to outside interference competing with his professional obligation to follow orders and potentially improve his unit's capabilities. "Fine," he said finally. "Tomorrow morning, 0800 hours. You'll shoot our standard precision qualification course using our equipment and following our safety protocols. Thompson will be your range safety officer." "I appreciate the opportunity, Chief," Maria said sincerely. "I'll do my best not to embarrass myself." Morrison's smile was thin and lacking warmth. "Oh, I'm sure you'll do just fine, Rodriguez. Our standard course uses the M24 system at distances from 300 to 1,000 meters. 12 shots total, mixed conditions. Passing score is 9 out of 12 hits in the designated kill zones." As they concluded the tour and headed back toward the administrative building, Maria could feel the weight of tomorrow's challenge settling over her. She understood that this wasn't just about marksmanship. It was about proving whether she belonged in this environment, whether her ideas deserved serious consideration, and whether she could earn the respect of some of the military's most elite operators. That evening, she sat in her hotel room, cleaning her personal rifle, a customized Remington 700 that she had carried through 2 deployments and countless training exercises. The weapon was an extension of herself, every component precisely adjusted to her shooting style and preferences. She wouldn't be using it tomorrow, but the familiar routine of maintenance helped focus her mind and calm her nerves. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her former commanding officer, Colonel Martinez, who had recommended her for this assignment. "Heard you're stirring up the SEAL community. Don't let them intimidate you. You've got skills they need, whether they admit it or not." Maria smiled as she replied, "Just trying to do the job, sir. We'll see how tomorrow goes." But she knew that tomorrow would be about much more than just hitting targets. It would be about challenging assumptions, proving that excellence could come from unexpected sources, and demonstrating that the best solutions sometimes came from those who approach problems differently. She spent the next hour reviewing the ballistic data for the M24 system, familiarizing herself with its characteristics and capabilities. The rifle was an excellent platform, though different from her personal weapon in several key aspects. The trigger pull would be heavier, the stock geometry slightly different, and she would need to adapt to its specific ballistic properties. More importantly, she needed to understand the psychological dynamic she would face tomorrow. Morrison clearly saw her as an outsider threatening his unit's reputation and methods. Thompson seemed more open to new ideas, but would likely defer to his chief's judgment. The other SEALs would be watching to see if this civilian contractor could back up her implied claims with actual performance. Maria had faced similar tests before, but never with stakes quite this high. Her recommendations could potentially influence training protocols that would affect the lives of elite operators in future combat situations. If she failed to demonstrate credibility tomorrow, her insights, no matter how valid, would likely be dismissed. As she finally prepared for sleep, Maria reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. Growing up in a small Texas town, she had learned to shoot helping her grandfather control predators threatening their cattle ranch. Her natural talent had caught the attention of her high school ROTC instructor, leading to a Marine Corps scholarship and eventually sniper training. But it wasn't just natural ability that had made her exceptional. She had always been drawn to understanding the science behind marksmanship, the physics of ballistics, the psychology of stress management, the subtle environmental factors that could affect accuracy. While other snipers focused on following established procedures, she had developed techniques that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. Tomorrow, she would have the chance to demonstrate those techniques to some of the world's most skilled marksmen. The question was whether they would be open enough to recognize innovation when they saw it, or whether their preconceptions would blind them to new possibilities. As she drifted off to sleep, Maria's last thought was of the 1,000-meter target that awaited her tomorrow. She had hit targets at that range hundreds of times before, under conditions far more challenging than anything a training course could provide. But tomorrow's shots would carry weight far beyond their impact on steel targets. They would determine whether her voice would be heard in discussions about the future of precision warfare training. The stakes were high, but Maria Rodriguez had never been one to back down from a challenge. Tomorrow, she would let her rifle do the talking. The alarm clock buzzed at 0530 hours, but Maria Rodriguez was already awake. She had spent the night in fitful sleep, her mind running through ballistic calculations and wind-reading techniques that had become second nature during her deployment years. The hotel room's blackout curtains couldn't quite block the glow of the San Diego streetlights, and she had found herself staring at the ceiling, visualizing the 1,000-meter shot that would likely determine whether the SEALs took her seriously. After a light breakfast and her usual pre-mission routine of stretching and breathing exercises, Maria arrived at the Naval Special Warfare Facility 30 minutes before her scheduled range time. The California morning was crisp, with offshore winds that would affect long-range shots. She could feel the subtle shift in air pressure that often preceded weather changes, a sensitivity developed through countless hours of reading environmental conditions in combat zones. Chief Morrison was waiting at the range entrance with Thompson and 3 other SEALs who had apparently volunteered to observe the morning's proceedings. Maria recognized the dynamics immediately. Morrison had assembled an audience to witness what he expected would be her failure to meet their standards. Rodriguez. Morrison nodded curtly. These are Petty Officers Williams, Jackson, and Reyes. They'll be observing today's qualification in case Admiral Hutchinson asks for their input on your consultation. Each SEAL acknowledged her with professional politeness that couldn't quite mask their skepticism. Williams was a compact man with the weathered hands of someone who had spent years handling precision instruments under extreme conditions. Jackson stood well over 6 feet tall with the rangy build of a natural athlete, while Reyes had the quiet intensity of a veteran operator who had seen serious combat. Gentlemen, Maria replied evenly. I appreciate you taking time from your training schedule. Thompson stepped forward with a hard case containing the M24 rifle system she would be using. Ma'am, this is our standard precision rifle. It's been zeroed at 100 meters and has documented ballistic data for all our training distances. The scope is a Leupold Mark IV with mil-dot reticle, and you'll be using federal gold medal match ammunition. Maria accepted the rifle and began her inspection routine. The M24 was indeed an excellent weapon system, a Remington 700 action with a heavy barrel designed for precision work. The stock was properly bedded, the trigger crisp and clean at approximately 3.5 pounds. The scope was high quality and clearly well-maintained. But as she handled the rifle, she noticed several things that differed from her personal preferences. The stock length of pull was slightly longer than optimal for her build, which would affect her natural point of aim. The bipod legs were adjusted for someone taller, and the cheek rest height would require modification for her to achieve proper scope alignment. Thompson, would it be possible to adjust the stock and bipod settings? She asked. I need to establish proper fit before we begin. Of course, Thompson replied, producing a small toolkit. What adjustments do you need? As Maria worked to customize the rifle fit, she was aware of the SEALs watching her every movement. She could sense their evaluation of her technique, looking for signs of inexperience or unfamiliarity with precision weapons. But her handling was smooth and professional, born of thousands of hours of practice and real-world application. Williams stepped closer, his curiosity apparently overcoming his initial skepticism. You've got good form with a rifle setup. Most consultants we get don't know enough to adjust the stock fit. Proper rifle fit is fundamental to consistent accuracy, Maria replied as she adjusted the cheek rest. If the gun doesn't fit the shooter, compensation becomes necessary, and compensation introduces variables that affect precision. Morrison checked his watch impatiently. Rodriguez, we need to get started. The range is scheduled for other training after 1,000 hours. Understood, Chief. I think we're ready. Thompson led them to the firing position while Morrison established himself at the spotting scope station. The range stretched out before them with target arrays at 300, 500, 700, and 1,000 meters. Each target was a precision steel plate with scoring zones clearly marked, the kind of targets designed to provide immediate feedback on shot placement. Standard procedure is 4 shots at 300 meters, 3 shots each at 500 and 700 meters, and 2 shots at the 1,000-meter line, Thompson explained. You'll have atmospheric data available, but you're responsible for your own wind calls and elevation adjustments. Maria studied the range conditions carefully. The wind was tricky, approximately 8 knots from the northwest at the firing position, but she could see vegetation movement downrange that indicated shifting patterns. The air was clear, but warming rapidly as the sun climbed higher, which would create mirage effects that could interfere with target resolution at extreme distances. Any questions about the course of fire? Morrison called from his position. No, Chief. I'm ready when you are. Maria settled into her shooting position with the smooth efficiency of long practice. Her body alignment was textbook perfect, supporting leg straight, shooting legs slightly bent, rifle supported by bone structure rather than muscle tension. But as she acquired her sight picture on the first 300-meter target, the watching SEALs noticed subtleties in her technique that differed from standard military training. Her breathing pattern was deeper and more controlled than typical, with longer pauses between inhale and exhale. Her grip on the rifle was lighter than most shooters preferred, allowing the weapon to recoil naturally rather than fighting against it. Most notably, she spent considerably more time reading wind conditions before each shot, studying vegetation movement and mirage patterns with the intensity of someone whose life had depended on such observations. Send it when ready, Thompson announced. Maria's first shot broke cleanly. The sound of the rifle followed immediately by the metallic ping of the bullet striking steel. Through the spotting scope, Morrison called out center hit, X-ring. Her next 3 shots at 300 meters were equally precise, each one finding the center scoring area with mechanical consistency. The SEALs exchanged glances. The shots were good, but not beyond their own capabilities. The real test would come at longer ranges where environmental factors would magnify any weaknesses in technique. Moving to the 500-meter targets, Maria made subtle adjustments to her scope elevation and took additional time to study the wind patterns. She noticed that the breeze had shifted slightly since her first shots, and vegetation movement indicated a more complex wind pattern than simple left-to-right drift. Her first shot at 500 meters struck slightly left of center, but still within the acceptable scoring zone. Maria frowned slightly, realizing that her wind call had been conservative. She made a small adjustment and fired her second shot, which found the center of the target precisely. Good correction, Williams commented quietly to Jackson. She read that wind shift faster than most. The third shot at 500 meters was another center hit, demonstrating that her adjustment had been accurate. Maria was now 6 for 6, but she knew the real challenges lay ahead at 700 and 1,000 meters, where environmental factors would test every aspect of her marksmanship skills. As she prepared for the 700-meter targets, Maria noticed subtle changes in the atmospheric conditions. The air temperature was rising more rapidly than she had initially calculated, which would affect her ballistic trajectory. More concerning, the wind patterns were becoming increasingly complex as thermal currents began to develop with the warming day. She spent nearly 2 minutes studying the range before settling into position for her first 700-meter shot. The target appeared much smaller through her scope, requiring precise hold and perfect trigger control. But as she aligned her crosshairs and began her final breathing sequence, she noticed something that made her pause. The mirage patterns visible through her scope indicated that the atmospheric conditions at the target location were different from those at the firing position. The shimmering effect was more pronounced, suggesting higher temperatures and different wind velocities downrange. This was exactly the kind of complex environmental reading that separated exceptional marksmen from merely skilled ones. Maria made additional adjustments to her point of aim, compensating not just for the measured wind at her position, but for the conditions she could observe at the target. Her shot broke cleanly, and after a brief pause, the sound of metal impact carried back across the range. Hit, center mass, Morrison called, but his tone carried a note of interest rather than mere confirmation. Her second shot at 700 meters was equally precise, but it was her technique rather than just her accuracy that was beginning to capture the SEALs' attention. Her wind reading method was more sophisticated than their standard training, incorporating visual cues and atmospheric observations that went beyond simple measurement tools. Reyes leaned toward Williams and spoke quietly. "She's reading conditions differently than our standard method. Look how long she studies the downrange environment before each shot." The third shot at 700 meters found its mark precisely, completing another perfect string. Maria was now 9 for 9, with only the most challenging shots remaining. But more importantly, her technique was demonstrating approaches to precision marksmanship that the SEALs hadn't seen in their conventional training. As she prepared for the 1,000-meter shots, Maria knew that this was the moment when her credibility would truly be tested. The extreme range would amplify every small error in technique, and the environmental conditions were becoming increasingly challenging as the morning progressed. She studied the target through her scope with intense concentration. At 1,000 meters, the steel plate appeared as little more than a small rectangle, requiring absolute precision in both aim and environmental compensation. The wind patterns were now fully complex, with visible indicators showing different velocities and directions at various points along the bullet's flight path. But as Maria prepared for what many considered the most difficult shots in precision marksmanship, she felt the familiar calm that had served her well in combat situations. Her breathing steadied, her mind cleared of distractions, and her focus narrowed to the essential elements of the shot: sight alignment, trigger control, and environmental compensation. Thompson watched her preparation with growing respect. Her pre-shot routine was longer and more detailed than typical military training called for, but it was clearly the product of extensive real-world experience. She wasn't just following procedures. She was reading conditions with the expertise of someone who understood that precision shooting was as much art as science. Morrison, despite his initial skepticism, found himself paying close attention to her technique. Her approach to wind reading incorporated methods he hadn't seen in 20 years of military service, and her accuracy up to this point had been flawless. As much as he wanted to dismiss her as an outsider, her performance was forcing him to acknowledge her capabilities. The first 1,000-meter shot would be the critical moment. Success would validate her credentials and force the SEALs to take her observations seriously. Failure would confirm Morrison's suspicions and effectively end her influence on their training protocols. Maria settled into position, her movements calm and deliberate. Through her scope, she could see heat waves rising from the warming ground, creating complex mirage patterns that would affect her sight picture. The wind indicators showed a challenging pattern of shifts and swirls that would require precise compensation. She made her final adjustments to scope settings and body position, then began the breathing sequence that would culminate in the shot. The watching SEALs maintained absolute silence, understanding that this moment would determine not just her qualification score, but her standing within their community. As Maria's finger took up the slack and the trigger, she felt the familiar moment of stillness that preceded every important shot of her career. The rifle was an extension of her will, the target a distant but achievable goal, and the environmental challenges simply factors to be calculated and overcome. The shot would either prove her worth or end her mission. But as she prepared to fire, Maria Rodriguez was exactly where she belonged, behind a precision rifle, facing a challenge that would test every skill she had developed through years of dedication to the art and science of extreme range marksmanship. The next few seconds would determine whether the SEALs would listen to her ideas or whether she would become just another consultant whose recommendations were politely ignored. But first, she had to hit a target that tested the very limits of what was possible with a rifle. The silence on the firing line stretched for what felt like minutes, but was actually only seconds. Maria Rodriguez held her breath in a natural respiratory pause, her crosshairs steady on a 1,000-meter target that appeared impossibly small through her scope. The wind indicators showed a complex pattern that would challenge even the most experienced marksman, but her mind had already calculated the necessary adjustments. The rifle recoiled smoothly against her shoulder, the sound of the shot echoing across the range. For a moment that seemed frozen in time, everyone waited for the sound of impact that would indicate whether her shot had found its mark. When a metallic ping finally reached them, carried on the morning breeze, it was followed by Chief Morrison's reluctant confirmation. "Hit," said her mass. The words hung in the air like smoke, their implications settling over the group of watching SEALs. Williams exchanged a meaningful glance with Jackson, while Reyes simply nodded in appreciation of what he had just witnessed. Thompson, monitoring the spotting scope, provided additional detail that made the shot even more impressive. "Dead center of the X-ring," he announced. "That's a perfect shot under these wind conditions." Maria cycled the bolt smoothly, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering her final round. She knew that one perfect shot could be attributed to luck, but consistency at extreme range was the true measure of a marksman's skill. This second 1,000-meter shot would either confirm her capabilities or raise questions about the first. She took her time studying the conditions again. The atmospheric situation had continued to evolve as the morning progressed, with thermal currents now creating more complex wind patterns. The mirage was becoming more pronounced as the ground temperature rose, and she could see subtle shifts in the air density that would affect her bullet's trajectory. Morrison watched her preparation with growing attention. Her technique was clearly different from standard military training, more deliberate, more comprehensive in its environmental assessment. She was reading conditions that their current protocols didn't emphasize, yet her accuracy was undeniable. "Rodriguez," he called out, "how are you making your wind calls? Your technique is different from our standard methods." Maria paused in her preparation and looked back toward the spotting position. "Chief, I'm reading atmospheric layers rather than just surface wind. The bullet travels through different air masses during its flight, especially at extreme range. Surface measurements only tell part of the story." William stepped closer, his curiosity clearly engaged. "What do you mean by atmospheric layers?" "Watch the mirage patterns through your spotting scope," Maria replied, pointing toward different sections of the range. "See how the heat waves move differently at various distances? Each change indicates different wind conditions at that point. The bullet has to travel through all of those different air masses." Thompson adjusted his spotting scope to follow her indication, studying the mirage patterns with new attention. "I see what you mean. The movement is different at the 500-meter mark compared to the target area." "Exactly. Traditional wind reading focuses on conditions at the firing position and target, but ignores everything in between. For extreme-range shots, you need to account for the entire flight path." Morrison frowned, processing this information. Their current training protocols emphasize ballistic computers and measurement devices, with wind calls based primarily on flags and measuring instruments at specific locations. The idea of reading atmospheric conditions along the entire bullet path was more complex than their standard methods. "That's a more advanced technique than we typically teach," he admitted reluctantly. "Where did you learn that approach?" "Afghanistan," Maria replied simply. "When you're making shots that could save your team's life, you learn to use every available piece of information. Environmental reading becomes a survival skill." She returned her attention to the rifle, settling back into position for her final shot. The second 1,000-meter target waited, its steel surface reflecting the morning sun in a way that created additional visual challenges. But Maria had shot under far more difficult conditions, including combat situations where enemy fire and time pressure made careful preparation impossible. Her final breathing sequence began, deeper and more controlled than standard military training called for. The technique was something she had developed during her deployments, combining elements of meditation with physiological control to achieve maximum stability during the most critical moments. The watching SEALs noticed the unusual rhythm of her breathing pattern. Most marksmen used a simple breath hold technique, but Maria's approach seemed to actively use her respiratory cycle to enhance her stability and focus. It was subtle, but clearly effective, given her performance so far. The second shot broke as cleanly as the first, with the same smooth follow-through that characterized expert marksmanship. Again, The moment of silence stretched across the range until the sound of impact confirmed another successful hit. Hit! X-ring again, Morrison announced, his tone now carrying unmistakable respect. That's 11 out of 11 perfect shots. Maria safely cleared her rifle and set it aside, then rose from the firing position with the fluid motion of someone completely comfortable with precision weapons. Her qualification was technically complete. 11 hits out of 11 attempts represented a perfect score that exceeded even the SEAL's high standards. Thompson was studying the target data on his electronic monitoring system, shaking his head in amazement. Maria, both of your 1,000-meter shots are within 2 inches of dead center. Under these wind conditions, that's exceptional shooting. Williams approached with obvious interest in discussing her techniques. That environmental reading method you described, is that something you could teach to our precision teams? It's not complicated once you understand what to look for, Maria replied. But it does require more training time than traditional wind calling methods. The payoff is significantly improved accuracy under challenging conditions. Morrison was quiet for several moments, clearly processing what he had witnessed. His initial skepticism about this civilian contractor was difficult to maintain in the face of her perfect performance and demonstrated expertise. The technique she had described addressed exactly the kinds of challenges his units had encountered in recent operations. Rodriguez, he said finally, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your capabilities that weren't justified. No apology necessary, Chief. Skepticism is appropriate when evaluating new approaches to training. Results speak louder than credentials. Reyes stepped forward with a question that reflected the practical concerns of an operational sniper. This atmospheric reading technique, how long does it take to learn? Our deployment schedules don't allow for extended training periods. The basic concepts can be taught in a few days, Maria explained. Mastery takes longer, but even basic application produces measurable improvement in accuracy. I could design a compressed course that fits within your existing training cycles. Jackson had been quietly observing throughout the morning, but now his interest was clearly engaged. What other techniques do you use that differ from our current training? Maria considered the question carefully. She had developed numerous innovations during her military service, but she wanted to focus on those most applicable to SEAL operations. There are several areas where I think we could improve your current protocols. Stress inoculation training, equipment adaptation for different environmental conditions, and advanced ballistic calculation methods that don't rely on electronic devices. Thompson looked intrigued by the last point. Ballistic calculations without computers? How does that work? Mental math and reference systems, Maria replied. Electronic devices can fail, especially in hostile environments. Having backup calculation methods can be the difference between mission success and failure. Morrison was now fully engaged in the conversation, his earlier resistance replaced by professional interest. Rodriguez, I want to hear more about these training modifications. Can you put together a comprehensive presentation of your recommendations? Of course, Chief. I can have a detailed analysis ready for review within 48 hours. I'll include specific protocols, training timelines, and implementation strategies. As they began walking back toward the administrative building, the dynamic between Maria and the SEALs had fundamentally shifted. Her perfect shooting performance had established her credibility in a way that no amount of credentials or recommendations could have achieved. Now, they were treating her as a peer rather than an outsider. Williams fell in a step beside her, clearly eager to continue the technical discussion. The breathing technique you used, that was different from standard instruction. Is that something you developed yourself? Partially, Maria replied. I combined traditional marksmanship breathing with some meditation techniques I learned from a Buddhist monk in Afghanistan. He was helping treat PTSD cases at our base, and I realized his breathing methods could enhance shooting stability. The unconventional source of her technique raised eyebrows, but none of the SEALs could argue with its effectiveness. Thompson, walking on her other side, was already thinking about practical applications. Could that breathing method be integrated into our current precision training curriculum? He asked. Easily. It actually reduces training time because it helps shooters achieve stability faster than traditional methods. The meditation aspect also helps with stress management during high-pressure situations. As they reached the administrative building, Morrison paused to address the group. "Gentlemen, I want you to clear your schedules for tomorrow afternoon. Rodriguez is going to present her training recommendations, and I want your full attention and input." The SEALs nodded their agreement, their earlier skepticism now replaced by genuine interest in what they might learn. Maria's demonstration had proved that innovation could come from unexpected sources, and that excellence required constant willingness to examine and improve established methods. But as they prepared to part ways, Maria knew that earning their respect through marksmanship was only the first step. The real challenge would be convincing them to implement changes to training protocols that had been developed over decades of operational experience. Tradition and proven methods carried enormous weight in military culture, and proposing modifications required both sensitivity and compelling evidence. "Chief Morrison," she said as the group began to disperse, "I'd like to include some historical case studies in tomorrow's presentation. Examples of how similar techniques have been successfully implemented in other elite units." "That sounds appropriate," Morrison replied. "But I want you to understand something, Rodriguez. My men's lives depend on the reliability of their training. Any changes we make have to be thoroughly tested and validated before they go operational." "I completely understand, Chief. I'm not suggesting we replace proven methods, just enhance them with additional capabilities. Everything I'll propose has been combat tested and verified." As Maria walked to her rental car, she reflected on the morning's events. Her perfect shooting performance had opened doors that credentials alone never could have. But, more importantly, she had identified areas where her innovations could genuinely improve the SEALs' operational effectiveness. The techniques she planned to present weren't theoretical concepts developed in controlled environments. They were hard-won lessons learned through combat experience, refined through necessity, and validated through successful application under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Tomorrow's presentation would be crucial. She needed to demonstrate not just what her methods could achieve, but how they could be integrated into existing training without disrupting operational readiness. The SEALs had given her an opportunity to prove her worth, and now she had to deliver recommendations that would make their dangerous missions more likely to succeed. But as she drove back to her hotel, Maria felt confident that she could meet that challenge. Her rifle had done the talking today, and tomorrow her ideas would have the chance to speak just as clearly. Maria Rodriguez spent the next 36 hours preparing the most important presentation of her military consulting career. Her hotel room had been transformed into a temporary command center, with ballistic charts, training protocols, and case study materials spread across every available surface. She had contacted former colleagues from 3 different military units to gather supporting data for her recommendations, and the response had been overwhelmingly positive. The presentation was scheduled for 1,400 hours in the main briefing room at the Naval Special Warfare Facility. Admiral Hutchinson himself had decided to attend, along with Chief Morrison, the 5 SEALs who had witnessed her shooting demonstration, and several other senior personnel whose input would be crucial for any training protocol changes. As Maria set up her materials, she could feel the weight of expectation in the room. Her perfect shooting performance had earned her the right to be heard, but now she had to prove that her ideas could translate into practical improvements for some of the military's most elite operators. "Ladies and gentlemen," Admiral Hutchinson announced as the briefing began, "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez has been brought in to evaluate our current precision training protocols and provide recommendations for enhancement. Based on yesterday's demonstration, I think we can all agree that her expertise deserves our serious attention." Maria stood before the assembled group, drawing on years of military briefing experience to project confidence despite the high stakes. "Thank you, Admiral. Over the past 2 days, I've observed your current training methods and identified several areas where we can enhance accuracy and effectiveness without compromising the excellent foundation you've already established." She activated the first slide of her presentation, which showed comparative accuracy data from various elite military units worldwide. Our analysis begins with the recognition that your current precision training already produces exceptional results. However, recent operational challenges suggest opportunities for improvement, particularly in extreme-range engagements under adverse conditions. Chief Morrison leaned forward in his chair, his attention fully engaged. The data Maria presented included accuracy statistics from British SAS units, Israeli Defense Force snipers, and Canadian Special Operations Forces, all units that had implemented variations of her recommended techniques with measurable improvement in performance. The core of my recommendations centers on three primary areas, Maria continued. Enhanced environmental reading techniques, stress inoculation protocols, and equipment adaptation strategies. Each of these builds upon your existing training rather than replacing it. Thompson raised his hand with question. Rodriguez, the environmental reading techniques you demonstrated yesterday, can you explain how they differ from our current wind calling methods? Maria had anticipated this question and moved to a detailed slide showing atmospheric layer analysis. Current military training focuses on surface wind measurement and target area conditions. This approach works well for shots under 800 meters, but extreme-range precision requires understanding the entire atmospheric column through which the bullet travels. She pointed to a diagram showing wind variations at different altitudes and distances. Yesterday's shooting conditions provided a perfect example. Surface winds were 8 knots from the northwest, but atmospheric observation revealed different conditions at the 500 and 700 meter points. Traditional wind calls would have missed those variations. Williams studied the diagram with obvious interest. This is similar to aviation weather analysis. Pilots learned to read atmospheric layers for flight planning. Exactly, Maria confirmed. I adapted meteorological techniques for ground-based precision shooting. The principles are the same, understanding how atmospheric conditions change across distance and altitude. Admiral Hutchinson interjected with a practical concern. Rodriguez, how long does this training take to implement? Our deployment schedules are tight, and we can't afford extended training periods. That's one of the advantages of this approach, Admiral. Basic atmospheric reading can be taught in a 3-day module that fits within existing precision training cycles. Advanced techniques require additional practice, but even basic application produces measurable improvement. She moved to the next section of her presentation, which addressed stress inoculation training. Current precision training emphasizes perfect conditions and controlled environments. While this builds fundamental skills, it doesn't adequately prepare shooters for the physiological stress of combat situations. Reyes, who had extensive combat experience, nodded in agreement. That's a valid concern. Range performance doesn't always translate to operational effectiveness under stress. My stress inoculation protocols introduce controlled physiological challenges during precision training, Maria explained. Elevated heart rate, breathing restriction, time pressure, and environmental distractions. The goal is to maintain accuracy while managing the physical effects of stress. She showed video footage from training exercises where snipers performed precision shots immediately after intense physical exertion. The footage demonstrated how stress inoculation training maintained accuracy levels that would normally deteriorate under physical and psychological pressure. Morrison studied the data carefully. What kind of accuracy improvement have other units seen with this training? British SAS reported a 23% improvement in combat accuracy after implementing stress inoculation protocols, Maria replied. Israeli Defense Force units showed similar results. The key is gradual exposure that builds tolerance without compromising safety. Jackson raised a practical question about implementation. How would this integrate with our current qualification standards? We can't lower our accuracy requirements. Actually, these techniques typically increase qualification scores, Maria explained. Stress inoculation makes normal range conditions feel easy by comparison. Shooters often see immediate improvement in their standard scores. The presentation moved to equipment adaptation strategies, an area where Maria's combat experience provided unique insights. Standard military precision rifles are configured for average users under ideal conditions. Individual adaptation can significantly improve performance, especially for operators with non-standard physical characteristics or specific operational requirements. She demonstrated the stock adjustments she had made to the M24 rifle during her qualification, explaining how proper fit affected natural point of aim and recoil management. Small adjustments to stock length, cheek rest height, and bipod configuration can produce measurable accuracy improvements. More importantly, proper rifle fit reduces fatigue during extended operations. Thompson was taking detailed notes throughout the presentation. This fits with some observations we've made during long-duration missions. Shooter fatigue becomes a factor after several hours of precision work. Exactly, Maria confirmed. Proper equipment fit extends operational effectiveness and maintains accuracy throughout extended engagements. The modifications are simple and reversible, allowing rifles to be quickly adapted for different operators. As she reached the final section of her presentation, Maria addressed the most sensitive aspect of her recommendations: modifications to established training doctrine. Everything I presented builds upon your existing excellent foundation. I'm not suggesting we replace proven methods, but rather enhance them with additional capabilities that address specific operational challenges. Admiral Hutchinson leaned back in his chair, considering the comprehensive presentation he had just witnessed. Rodriguez, these recommendations appear sound, but implementation in an operational unit requires careful consideration. What's your suggested timeline for testing and validation? I recommend a phased approach, Admiral. Start with a small test group using 1 or 2 techniques. Evaluate results over a 90-day period. Then, expand implementation based on performance data. This allows us to validate effectiveness without disrupting overall unit readiness. Chief Morrison had been quiet through much of the presentation, but now he spoke with the authority of someone who understood both the potential and the risks of changing established procedures. Rodriguez, I have to ask directly, are you confident these techniques will improve our operational effectiveness without introducing new vulnerabilities? The question went to the heart of military training philosophy. Innovation had to be balanced against reliability, and any changes to proven methods carried inherent risks. Maria understood that her answer would likely determine whether her recommendations were implemented or filed away as interesting but impractical suggestions. Chief, every technique I presented has been combat tested under conditions as challenging as those your teams face. I wouldn't recommend anything I hadn't personally used in life or death situations. That said, proper validation testing is essential before full implementation. She moved to her final slide, which showed a proposed pilot program structure. I suggest starting with a volunteer group of 6 to 8 shooters who would test these techniques while maintaining their current training schedule. We evaluate performance over 3 months, document lessons learned, and then make informed decisions about broader implementation. Williams raised his hand with a logistical question. Would you be available to personally conduct this pilot training? Absolutely, Maria replied. I can commit to a 3-month assignment to ensure proper implementation and provide ongoing support during the evaluation period. Admiral Hutchinson stood, indicating the formal conclusion of the briefing. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been a comprehensive presentation of some innovative approaches to precision training. Chief Morrison, I want you to work with Rodriguez to develop a detailed pilot program proposal. If we can improve our operational effectiveness, we owe it to our people to explore these possibilities. As the group began to disperse, Thompson approached Maria with obvious enthusiasm. Rodriguez, I'd like to volunteer for the pilot program. Based on what I saw yesterday and heard today, I think these techniques could make a real difference. Williams and Reyes quickly added their names to the volunteer list, followed by Jackson. Within minutes, Maria had more volunteers than she needed for the initial test group, a clear indication that her presentation had successfully convinced the SEALs of her recommendation's potential value. Chief Morrison lingered after the others had left, his expression thoughtful. Rodriguez, I owe you another apology. I let my preconceptions color my judgment about your capabilities and ideas. Your presentation today was professional and comprehensive. Thank you, Chief. I understand the protective instinct you feel toward your men and their training. Change should always be approached carefully in units where lives depend on established procedures. That said, Morrison continued, if these techniques can improve our people's chances of coming home safely, then we have an obligation to explore them thoroughly. I'm willing to personally oversee the pilot program to ensure it gets proper attention and resources. As Maria packed up her presentation materials, she reflected on how dramatically the situation had changed since her arrival 3 days earlier. The skeptical reception she had initially encountered had been replaced by genuine interest and support for her recommendations. More importantly, she had established relationships with key personnel who could ensure successful implementation of her ideas. The next 3 months will be crucial. The pilot program would provide real-world validation of techniques she had developed through combat experience and refined through years of practice. Success would likely lead to broader adoption throughout the SEAL community and potentially other elite military units. But as she prepared to leave the briefing room, Maria was already thinking beyond the immediate pilot program. The techniques she had presented represented just a portion of the innovations she had developed during her military service. If this initial implementation proved successful, there would be opportunities to introduce additional enhancements that could further improve precision training effectiveness. The afternoon sun was setting over San Diego Bay as Maria walked to her rental car, but she felt energized rather than tired. The challenge of proving herself to some of the military's most elite operators had been met successfully, and now the real work of improving their capabilities could begin. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Colonel Martinez. Heard the briefing went well. Proud of you for persevering through the skepticism. Make sure you document everything for the broader military community. Maria smiled as she typed her reply. Mission accomplished, sir. Now comes the real challenge of proving these techniques work in operational conditions. But as she drove back toward her hotel, Maria Rodriguez knew she was exactly where she belonged, working with elite military professionals to push the boundaries of what was possible in precision warfare. The initial skepticism about her gender, size, and civilian contractor status had given way to respect earned through demonstrated competence. Tomorrow, she would begin working with Chief Morrison to design the detailed pilot program that would determine whether her innovations would become part of SEAL training doctrine. It was a responsibility she didn't take lightly, knowing that the techniques they validated could eventually affect the safety and effectiveness of operators in combat zones around the world. The woman who had been dismissed as an outsider 3 days earlier was now positioned to influence training protocols for some of America's most elite warriors. Her rifle had spoken first, but now her ideas would have the chance to prove their worth through the most rigorous testing possible, actual implementation by operators whose lives depended on their precision shooting skills.